Hey, welcome everyone. Thank you very much for attending day one of our ClimateForward Efficiency Symposium. My name is Edward Yin, Director of ACEEE's Utilities Program, and I'll be facilitating this webinar. Before we begin, a couple of housekeeping announcements. So we'll be recording this webinar as well as a transcript and accompanying slides, and those will be made available to all registrants within a few business days. And to ask a question during the webinar, please type it out in the chat, and we'll get it. We'll get to it during our Q&A segment toward the end of the webinar. The agenda for this webinar, which is on our webpage for ClimateForward Efficiency Initiative, is as follows. There will be a short introductory remarks from myself and our Executive Director, Steve Nadell. We'll then go straight into the summary presentation of our latest research report, followed by a short Q&A session. We'll then have a lightning round of presentations by 9 distinguished speakers, which will be followed by a moderated Q&A session. So let's get into the topic. As you all know, there's a fundamental difference between decarbonization that is grounded in maximum efficiency and one that isn't. The former option costs less, it is better for the environment and health, and it often better reflects the values of the communities where these measures are deployed. And the smaller energy footprint that efficiency produces allows societies to decarbonize much quicker. So a truly transformative path that moves us from the business as usual toward 1.5 degree decarbonization should go through energy efficiency. So I'm very excited about the ClimateForward Efficiency Initiative, which will allow us to make this essential pivot. And now I'd like to introduce Steve Nadell, the Executive Director of ACEEE. His bio is way too extensive for me to summarize, so I'll leave it at his title. He'll provide a more comprehensive view of this effort. So Steve.
Thank you. I'm happy to participate and look forward to both hearing Mike talk about our roadmap and all the other presentations and discussion. Why don't we go to the next slide? Okay, just by way of brief background, ACEEE is a nonprofit research organization. It uses our research as the foundation for our education, as well as our program and policy technical assistance and advocacy activities. Next slide. So 2 years ago, we did a study looking at what is the role of energy efficiency in helping to address climate change. We came to the conclusion that energy efficiency can reduce US greenhouse gas emissions in half. In other words, it will get us halfway to the goal of full decarbonization. And ClimateForward efficiency in the utility sector will be an important part. As you can see, many different colors in this graph. There's opportunities in all the different sectors, whether it's residential, commercial, industrial, transportation. Next slide. Looking more broadly, ClimateForward efficiency needs the many different components that will be needed for decarbonization. This is from an NRDC study a few years ago, but they found the blue efficiency is the largest contributor. We need a cleaner grid as the next biggest. We need electrification. That's the third one, as well as various other uses such as decarbonizing remaining fuel use. Next slide. So we see energy efficiency as a critical ingredient in this. Obviously, for decades, we've been talking about how efficiency saves money, how it creates jobs, and how it reduces environmental harms. In recent years, climate change has been a key environmental harm that efficiency can help avert. But I'd also note other pollutants, whether it's SOx, NOx, mercury, fine particles. These often are emitted in conjunction with the greenhouse gases. And we need to look at all of them together, particularly in environmental justice communities. Climate change is important, but some of these other pollutants can be even more important, but they actually usually occur together. So as we reduce PM or NOx or SOx, we often, not always, but will often also reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide. Energy efficiency does tend to be low cost. This is comparing our estimates of the average cost of energy efficiency from review of hundreds of programs to costs of various different power sources. As you can see, efficiency is a little bit lower than wind and solar and a lot lower than everything else. And I would note that the wind and solar doesn't include storage, but as they go up, more storage will be needed, which will somewhat increase their costs. Next slide. So we think that these various decarbonization components complement each other, that climate forward efficiency means efficiency done in parallel with electrification, with renewables, with carbon-free fuels, with new ways of doing things, such as structural wood instead of steel and concrete in appropriate applications. Many of these are effectively variations on efficiency, but we need to do them all together if we're going to decarbonize. Two analogies. One, peanut butter and jelly. If efficiency is the peanut butter, we have lots of different jellies. It's hard to do one without the other. Yes, I know there's some diehards who just love peanut butter and not the jelly. Most people don't, just ask your kids. Another is a basketball analogy. People have what's called the pivot foot as they look to who to pass to. In this case, efficiency is the pivot foot, and it will work with the rest of the team, whether it's electrification, renewables, carbon-free fuels, et cetera, but it's a central component. So next slide. Just to give one example, this is a study we did late last year on using energy efficiency and demand response to address Texas's reliability challenges. This particular chart looks at winter peak demand, and in Texas, we found that the biggest demand reductions could be through a form of efficiency, replacing existing electric furnaces with much more efficient heat pumps. Also, insulation and air sealing of attics was a big one, smart thermostats, as well as various types of demand response measures. If we're really going to address the problem in Texas and address problems unique to the rest of the US, all of these need to work together. Next slide. And with that, I turn it back over to Edward, and here's my contact information if people have questions. So thank you, and Edward, back to you.
Yeah, Steve, thank you for sharing that compelling vision and providing that analysis of how we can accelerate decarbonization through efficiency. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mike Station. Mike's the Utilities Manager at ACEEE and previously served as a member of the Emerging Technologies team at the Building Technologies Office of USDOE. Along with Rachel Gold and Jasmine Ma, and Mike authored a report titled The Roadmap for Climate Forward Efficiency, which includes specific strategies for aligning energy efficiency with climate change action. So he'll present a summary of that report. So Mike, take it away.
All right, thank you very much, Edward, for that introduction. Before I dive into the details of this report that we released this morning, I want to start by placing it in context. And if we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. This report is the second that was released as part of ACEEE's Climate Forward Efficiency Initiative. We launched this initiative about a year ago with the question, do utility energy efficiency programs need to evolve to align with deep decarbonization goals? We suspected that the answer to this question was yes, but we weren't sure. So in December, we published the first report of this initiative that concluded, for a variety of reasons, yes, this is a fact, a transition that needs to take place. Next slide, please. That the future of energy efficiency is in fact climate forward efficiency. But just to make sure that we're all on the same page about what climate forward efficiency actually is, let me take a moment to define the term. So in our view, climate forward efficiency actions are those that treat energy efficiency as an intentional driver of greenhouse gas reductions, scale to meet the magnitude of decarbonization goals, leverage energy efficiency as a tool to mitigate and adapt to the impacts of climate change on customers by advancing equity, enhancing resilience and improving health outcomes, prioritize energy efficiency investments based on their time, seasonal, and geographic impacts, and enable prioritizations of investments across fuels, systems, and sectors, particularly from electrification. So given that there is a need to make this transition, what do we do about it? What actions do we take? What strategies do we employ? Right? These are big questions. So starting in April, we began soliciting input from experts through extended interviews, workshops, and external review. The recommendations that I'm about to share are the product of over 80 experts in the energy efficiency space. That does not mean that these recommendations are comprehensive, but the report does I think a good job of fairly assessing what stakeholders need to do to make sure that efficiency programs at utilities are meeting the needs of both this moment and of the future. So without further ado, here are the 9 roadmap strategies to accelerate climate-forward efficiency. You will notice that 8 of the strategies are sorted into 3 buckets: those that deal with getting policy and regulation correct, those that deal with program design and operation, and those that deal with preparing the market. And the arrows indicate that each of these strategies informs and impacts the others. These 8 strategies surround a 9th strategy, centering equity. We believe that equity needs to be considered and embedded in all aspects of this transition, and so we placed it right at the center, adjacent to everything else that we do. Now, as you read through the report, you will notice that every strategy follows effectively the same structure. Next slide, please. We begin with a concise overview of the strategy itself. Then we offer 3 to 4 options for realizing the strategy. Each of those options is accompanied by a table of discrete actions that stakeholders can take in the near and medium terms. And then each strategy section also includes additional standalone examples where we see the strategy either in practice or in preparation. And let's go through the strategy, shall we? So looks like we're a little behind on slides. Here we go. Actions, and those are the examples. There we go. Great. All right. So the first strategy we have is center equity. The reason center equity is so important is that members of low-income, environmental justice, or otherwise underserved communities already bear a disproportionate share of high energy burdens and the impacts of climate change. So the goal is to create energy solutions that equitably distribute the benefits and burdens to all community members. The 3 options that we have under this strategy are: engage communities and stakeholders in planning and decision-making, establish equity accountability standards, and collect needed equity data. We believe that utilities should commit to a collaborative process, design process that incorporates the needs of and feedback from the communities that they intend to serve. And part of that involves making sure that surveys, meetings, marketing, whatever mediums are used, are accessible in terms of language, times of day offered, etc. And state legislators can set equity performance standards, but you can't manage what you can't measure. So steps must be taken to collect data on underserved communities and how these programs end up impacting them. The second strategy is set climate commitments. Setting climate commitments provides utilities with a guiding light. It provides them with targets to shoot for, which can improve planning. The options here are for states and utilities to establish science-based climate targets, such as limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. However, some commissions do not consider environmental protection or equity or market transformation, for that matter, to be part of their regulatory charge. So legislators can clarify regulatory responsibilities by explicitly redefining or clarifying that commission decisions should consider these elements. With these pieces in place, utilities will then be in a position to translate their or their state's climate mandates into more explicit demand-side management targets, allowing them to set energy efficiency program goals and investment plans that align with these climate commitments. The third strategy is to update guidelines for resource eligibility and valuation. Many utilities face barriers to getting the best decarbonization technologies in the hands of their customers. One option to address this is for states to redefine the energy efficiency measures that ratepayers can support. So one example would be lifting prohibitions against fuel switching so that utilities can incentivize technologies that will save the most energy and reduce the most greenhouse gas emissions, regardless of what fuel powers them. Another helpful step is to reform cost effectiveness testing so that we count all of the benefits of climate-forward efficiency, including greenhouse gas reductions, resilience, better health outcomes, etc. We also recommend that states analyze the role and impacts of incentivizing fossil-fueled equipment that may operate for decades, so that each region ultimately can make a decision about the appropriate role for natural gas that fits their circumstances. The final policy alignment strategy is to reform utility business models. Utilities should be able to financially benefit from well-designed and well-executed climate-forward efficiency programs. But in many places, utilities still profit from volumetric sales of energy. One option is for states to establish or update revenue decoupling, which removes the incentive to maximize the number of kilowatt hours sold. Then, states should consider performance incentive mechanisms that align performance with GHG reductions so that utilities that meet certain climate-forward efficiency goals can be rewarded for doing so. At the same time, we understand that the grid is going to be more carbon intensive at some times than others, so regulators should reform rate design to benefit customers and grid decarbonization, while utilities should adopt new procurement models that use technology and ownership neutral methods to ensure utilities procure the most cost-effective and climate-aligned portfolio of resources. The first program delivery strategy is to design effective, scalable programs. Climate-forward efficiency programs may have more expansive goals, and they may also appeal to more diverse customer desires. Therefore, the conventional utility program model must evolve to ensure their customers' goals are being met effectively and in a way that scales to meet the magnitude of our climate challenge. Because energy is still a complicated subject for a lot of people, and only becomes more so when you're trying to decide between envelope upgrades, new HVAC systems, time of use rates, etc., utilities need to make programs easy for customers. And part of that involves appealing to what motivates customers to make these decisions, investments in the first place. So utilities should test and adjust marketing messages to smaller customer segments to make sure that those customers are being spoken to with the appropriate message and through messengers that appeal to what they care about. Utilities can also support market development and transformation, including offering midstream and upstream incentives to retailers and product manufacturers to help ensure that low carbon technologies are available and affordable for customers. The sixth strategy is to administer integrated programs. A truly holistic decarbonization strategy will involve a combination of energy efficiency, demand flexibility, electrification, renewable energy, and storage. Most utilities employ separate internal teams for one or more of these areas. However, if they are organized properly, aligning programs under a common entity or framework could streamline the process for customers and lead to better outcomes in the end. Now, one option for doing this is to bundle measures in customer offerings, such as combination, building envelope, and heat pump upgrades. Utilities can also offer staged upgrades so that customers unable to afford the full upfront cost of this transition can sequence those measures at a pace that works for them. A third option is to break down silos in regulation and utility operations as a way to better integrate and optimize customer-sited resources through a combined utility demand-side management planning team. And utilities should also unlock real-time program designs like meter-based pay for performance that can be enabled by intelligent, connected technologies that are able to capture real-time emissions reductions. The first market preparation strategy is to unlock necessary data. Planning, implementing, and evaluating climate-forward efficiency programs will require more types of data and at a higher resolution than traditional energy efficiency programs. Regulators can increase secure access to and use of energy consumption data. One application would be to disaggregate AMI interval data into individual end uses, which can reveal opportunities to address loads correlated with grids' carbon-intensive periods. An associated option is to improve measure, shape, and life data, which we can then map onto forecasts of marginal emission rates, or in other words, how much carbon dioxide we can avoid emitting per kilowatt hour saved through energy efficiency years into the future. In combination, those data will tell you which energy conservation measures will be most effective at reducing cumulative emissions over the lifetime of the equipment. And to choose between options, it will be helpful to leverage avoided cost data in such a way that the assumptions and methodologies that go into them can be open for public scrutiny, helping to ensure, for example, that avoided costs align with decarbonization goals in a way that can be used for decision-making. The eighth strategy we have is to prepare the workforce. The reality is that we can have the best policies and programs in the world, but if we do not have a workforce capable of implementing these updated utility programs, we're not going anywhere. States that have not done so already should consider conducting a regional workforce study that compares the skills and certifications that utilities would require of contractors for installing equipment like heat pumps and advanced controls with those that currently exist in the field. We're also calling for improved workforce reporting so that regulators can exercise oversight over workforce issues or possibly issue performance-based incentives for utilities meeting certain workforce goals, such as recruiting workers from a variety of backgrounds. For states that value the creation of long-lasting family-supporting careers, providing adequate accommodations and compensation for those workers can help as well. And the ninth and final strategy is secure funding. All of this work needs to be paid for, but the upside of climate-forward efficiency is that it can serve multiple policy goals. And many of those goals are shared by other agencies and organizations. So to lower the impact on ratepayers, we recommend braiding utility funding with other funding sources in a way that leverages the common goals of multiple organizations. Utilities can maximize federal funding opportunities by, for example, leveraging DOE's Weatherization Assistance Program to support energy efficiency improvements for low-income families, or leveraging federal preventative care and medical support funds to improve buildings in ways that enhance health benefits to residents. Utilities can also take advantage of regional, state, and local funding efforts, such as using Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative or RGGI funds or Volkswagen settlement funds for climate-forward efficiency activities. Or utilities could get creative and piggyback climate-forward efficiency on existing programs, like when the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power partnered with other City of Los Angeles departments to conduct building audits by piggybacking on a city program that inspects premises for habitability. Okay, so that was a lot. If you are wondering who actually needs to execute all of these strategies, in our assessment, the most prominent roles exist for state legislators, utilities and program administrators, and utility regulators. And this chart that you're seeing here is available in the report that we released today. Though there are also roles for other state agencies, program implementers, and others. And this graphic provides a rough timeline of which actions need to be taken by which actors and when. The details of this roadmap, of course, will be dependent on your state or territory's initial conditions and unique circumstances. So this should only be considered a guide, but I believe it does provide a good basis from which you can get started or continue your own ongoing efforts. And I will stop there and throw it back to Edward.
Yeah, Mike, thank you so much for that presentation. And again, just a reminder that you do not have to remember these 9 strategies. This roadmap is fully available for download. It's in the chat. Our colleague Ben York put the link to the roadmap in the chat box, so you can download it right away. Now we have a few minutes for Q&A on his summary, but before we do that, I would like to introduce Rachel Gold, who is one of the co-authors of the report, and who will also answer some of the questions with Mike. Rachel currently serves as principal of RMI's Carbon-Free Electricity Program, and she works with utilities, regulators, and advocates to evolve utility business models and regulations to support the rapid and equitable decarbonization of electricity systems. So the first question I would like to actually toss to Rachel, and then to be followed by Mike, are what are some good or promising examples that the states or utilities that are looking to adopt or implement this type of roadmap? What are some examples that they can look to? Rachel, would you like to start?
Thanks, Edward, and thanks for the opportunity to join you all today. I really appreciate it and look forward to the conversation. I think there's two kind of categories of examples that really stand out to me, and we're going to hear from a lot of the folks from these states in the Q&A and lightning round session soon. One is really states that are taking a leadership role and utilities that are taking a leadership role in updating the authority of public utilities commissions and changing the way that goals or mandates are structured for utilities. So great examples from Massachusetts, from Colorado, from Minnesota, from many of the states that we're going to hear from today in doing that work. And then to me, what's really exciting is looking to the states that are taking that direction from legislators, that direction from public utility commissions, and taking it to the next level and really implementing it. So two that stand out for me are, one is the District of Columbia, where we're going to hear about the new sustainable energy utility contract, which uses a really, I would say, innovative set of metrics to define success, including things like deep retrofits, greenhouse gas reductions. So I think that's one great example where the success of the energy efficiency program is going to be measured based on those characteristics. And another one that I'll highlight is Colorado, where we're seeing, in addition to greenhouse gas mandates that are focused on the electricity sector, we're seeing that move into the natural gas sector as well. And that's forcing a conversation about what does it look like to really rapidly decarbonize the gas sector. Efficiency has an important role there, but so does electrification, so do low carbon fuels. So it's exciting to see that evolution as well. Mike, curious what your favorite examples are.
Well, I'm glad that you issued some of them. And one of the things that we wanted to do as part of this symposium is share many of those examples. So I'm, like many of you, looking forward to the 3 o'clock hour when we get to hear people from many of those regions share those examples. Rather than give an explicit list, I would also encourage everybody in the early part of this presentation, I referenced that this is the second Climate Forward Efficiency report. Our first report, the need for climate forward efficiency, includes a list of states and utilities that are taking actions already. So there's a great list. I'm not promising it's comprehensive, but there's a great list that you can look through that'll give you more answers than I can tell in the time that I have to answer this question. And I would also add that we've included more examples explicitly associated with each of the strategies that we outlined in the report and with a large number of the options that I outlined as well. Of course, we probably don't have everything. So for those of you who are maybe aware of climate forward actions taking place in your territory that aren't in these reports or that don't come up in these conversations, please share them with us so that we can add to our understanding of this issue as it continues to develop.
Okay, so we really just have time for one more question, unfortunately. But I just want to remind that if your question wasn't answered during this round, Mike and Rachel will do their best to answer the questions in the chat offline. And those answers will be shared with everyone as part of the transcript of this webinar. So, I mean, we received several questions. The one that I'm just using my discretion as the moderator that I'm going to pick is one from David, who talked about, what is the outlook for utilities to incentivize forward efficiency when they are the likely candidate due to their owning customers, but are profitable from large capital investments in terms of generation and transmission. Could I toss that one to Rachel first?
Absolutely. It's a great question. And I think, the challenge David's recognizing is the fundamental challenge of the traditional utility business model that we've had in place for a long time in this country and which has served us well in deploying large capital investments, but which creates a challenge when we want to deploy customer-owned or distributed resources. And so I'll highlight maybe 3 quick things. 2 are strategies that ACEEE has been advocating for quite a long time, but which we're really seeing evolution in. One is revenue decoupling, which is sort of severing that link between sales and profits in a way that makes it so that at least efficiency is treated on a neutral basis with other resources. So that's an important piece of the puzzle. Some of the ways we think about revenue decoupling may need to be updated, and some of those policies may need to be tweaked. ACEEE has done some work on that over the last few years. The second is performance incentive mechanisms. So making sure that there is a shareholder-based incentive for delivering on energy efficiency, and in particular, delivering on the greenhouse gas reductions that we want to see from energy efficiency. And last but not least, I think there's a broader set of tools that we're seeing emerge around the country that help to sever that link between capital and operating expenses. One that I'll highlight that I've been really interested in lately is the TOTEX model that we're seeing from TOTEX rate making model that we're seeing in the UK. We're starting to see some states think about whether that might be applicable, whether that would be appropriate with US accounting gap rules. More to come on that. But I think that there's a lot of regulatory tools that we can use to make it so that utilities have the right set of incentives. And we're seeing, I think it's something like 6 or 7 states have open dockets on this question around performance-based rate making right now.
Yeah, that's exciting. Great. Well, thank you for that, Rachel. We'll just have to move on to the next segment. Again, our Mike and Rachel will do their best answering those questions that went unanswered just now. For this next segment, we have a very exciting lineup of distinguished speakers, and each speaker will be given about 3 minutes to briefly introduce themselves and share an example of or focus idea on climate forward efficiency. And during their presentation, if you have questions, again, please place them in the chat, and we'll have about 30 minutes for a robust round of Q&A. And I'll hand the segment over to Rachel to moderate.
Thanks, Edward. I'm pleased to kick off this segment. We're going to have a lot of fun hearing from a lot of great folks. So to start, I'm going to toss it to Jamie Fitzgerald, who is the Director of Legislative Affairs for Center for Energy Environment, to tell us a bit about what's going on in Minnesota and the Midwest.
Great. Thank you, Rachel. Really appreciate it. We can just go to the next slide, please. So a little bit of the obligatory opening slide for any of you unfamiliar with the Center for Energy and Environment. CEE is a nonprofit based in Minneapolis, but we do work throughout the Midwest. And we've been working on energy efficiency for over 40 years in research and development, programming, building and community consulting, lending, and policy. Next slide, please. So in May of 2021, Minnesota's legislature passed the Energy Conservation and Optimization Act, or ECO for short. And to understand how transformative ECO is to demand-side management and decarbonization, it's helpful to know how Minnesota's customer-facing programs have historically worked. Everything was pretty much so siloed. There was energy efficiency, load optimization, but that was typically done through PUC dockets. And then there was efficient fuel switching, what was a complete non-starter. It was not allowed in Minnesota. So what ECO looks to do is integrate and leverage all those components to provide customer-facing programs. And then it provides customers with more options in when and how much energy they use and what fuel source that they're using. Next slide, please. And the most significant change to Minnesota's energy policy is the ability to offer fuel switching programs. So it was critically important to safeguard and continue Minnesota's cost-effective and widely successful utility energy efficiency programs in ECO. And while developing ECO legislation, there were some core principles that helped to guide its formation: decarbonization and encouraging smart, efficient fuel switching while ensuring energy efficiency wasn't supplemented by it. So there was careful consideration to when efficient fuel switching is allowed, the criteria, and how it's counted or qualifies. And it's different for each utility service and business model. For example, electric IOUs, they continue to receive a financial incentive for energy efficiency savings and need to meet their energy efficiency goal of 1.75% before they can recoup any costs for their efficient fuel switching programs. But, and it's also key to note here, efficient fuel switching does not count towards their energy saving goals, and utilities do not receive a financial incentive for efficient fuel switching because, well, they're getting to build their load. We figured that was a pretty nice incentive. Municipal and cooperative utilities, they have a lower energy efficiency threshold to meet, and efficient fuel switching counts towards their energy savings goal once they meet that minimum. And that was done because they don't have an incentive structure and they're not publicly owned. And then I have to say, probably the most interesting is natural gas IOUs. So switching a customer to an electric measure is counted as the same as energy efficiency. So it counts towards the energy savings goal, which also then qualifies towards earning the savings incentive. It's probably stating the obvious, but this was done to give natural gas utilities motivation to reduce product consumption and then further decarbonize. And at the bottom of the slide, this lists the 4 criteria that are needed to be met for efficient fuel switching improvements to qualify, which includes greenhouse gas reductions. And a little different that Minnesota has decided to do than maybe a few other states that allow fuel switching is these calculations are source, not site, and includes full fuel cycle emissions. So now ECO is in the regulatory phase. And on today's panel and leading those efforts is Anthony Fryer with Minnesota's Department of Commerce. And I'm going to say, well, figuring out all the technical details from this legislation continues to be quite an adventure. And once the regulatory side wraps up, I think we've all earned a vacation. So thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. And I'll turn it over to Anthony now, who's the Conservation Improvement Program Supervisor from the Minnesota Commerce Department. Anthony.
Thank you, Rachel. As Jamie mentioned, just want to talk a little bit more about the implementation of the ECO Act and what we're looking at from a regulatory perspective at the moment. So everything that we do in terms of greenhouse gas emissions in the state of Minnesota is guided by a 80% reduction in gas emissions by 2050. That's the sort of umbrella policy that we're working towards. The Conservation Improvement Program is the implementation of the state's efficiency resource standard. We have about 120 utilities that participate in the program and have annual savings goals that they attempt to achieve each year. And the Minnesota Department of Commerce regulates utility performance in SIP and also provides technical assistance to help the utilities meet those goals. And historically, utility SIP performance has been measured in terms of kWh and therms saved. And what ECO does, and what Jamie alluded to, is it modernizes the SIP framework to provide a more holistic approach to efficiency programming. And I wanted to highlight 3 areas in which climate considerations are being incorporated into our utility efficiency programs through SIP now. The first is through efficient fuel switching. Utilities are required to demonstrate that fuel switching improvement results in net reduction of greenhouse gas emissions compared to whatever is being replaced. And this is the first time that a greenhouse gas emission has been required as part of a SIP program. It also requires that the Department of Commerce consider whether a fuel switching improvement can be operated in a manner that facilitates the integration of renewable energy into the electric system. And currently we're working with stakeholders to develop technical guidance for utilities to use in order to demonstrate the efficient fuel switching improvement meets the greenhouse gas reduction requirements and all of the other requirements that are listed in statute. Secondly, all utilities are required to provide a cost effectiveness analysis for all of their conservation improvement programs. And CO2 values are included in that cost effectiveness analysis in terms of the benefits of cleaner air because of avoided pollutants and carbon dioxide. So for efficient fuel switching, there's this explicit GHG reduction requirement. And then for all other programs in terms of cost effectiveness, there's a greenhouse gas reduction component to that as well. And then the third thing I wanted to highlight is that each year the Department of Commerce is required to provide an annual report on energy and capacity savings associated with the SIP program. And that also now includes an estimate of CO2 savings achieved in a particular year as well. So those are the 3 areas that we're incorporating climate considerations into SIP and also tracking the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the program and tracking those on an annual basis. So with that, I'll hand back to Rachel.
Thank you, Anthony. And now from the Midwest, we're moving back east to hear from State Senator Mike Barrett, a climate leader. Look forward to hearing about what's going on in Massachusetts.
Thank you, Rachel. Can you hear me okay?
Sure can.
Well, delighted to join you. Thank you and RMI for all your terrific work and advice to us in Massachusetts. And my thanks to ACEEE for this terrific program. We did, as it happens, consider major climate legislation last year in 2021. And while we were at it, we wanted to go after two of the objectives that ACEEE sketches out in its roadmap. We wanted to establish, Rachel, statewide climate targets, and that was a general interest of ours, quite apart from energy efficiency. And secondly, we did want to clarify the role that everyone must play in reaching those targets. So clarifying regulatory responsibility was an important step too. With respect to step one, we took a step that I haven't seen other states attempt, but that has worked well for us. We not only set an overall emissions reduction target every 10 years leading up to 2050, we also actually brought that target setting and that goal setting down to every 5 years. So every 5 years, our state must set an emissions reduction goal, all tracking toward 2050 so that we stay focused on the objective. But secondly, we created 6 sublimits, building toward the overall limit every 5 years, and again, all building toward 2050. 3 of those sublimits were a emissions reduction target beginning in 2025 for electric power generation. But we also created one for emissions from residential buildings, a third one for emissions from commercial and industrial buildings. And by the way, we set a 4th target, as it happens, for natural gas infrastructure and systems. All the sublimits have to be synergistic, contribute toward the realization of the 5-year overall limit, and all of that, again, trending toward 2050. But here's what we had noticed in the state legislature. Our very good energy efficiency program, it's always ranked in the top 1 or 2 by ACEEE, was operating in a parallel universe. The folks involved in its utility run in Massachusetts really did not want to be part of the emissions reduction game, the climate race. I think they felt protective about their somewhat separate franchise, realizing energy efficiency, as the report from ACEEE acknowledges, is not the same as realizing emissions reduction. And the folks running our efficiency program were bound and determined not to link the two. So the first thing we did in the Climate Act, after we set these limits and sublimits every 5 years, was to require that our Secretary of Energy and Environmental Affairs set a goal for every 3-year energy efficiency program in terms of its contribution to realizing the 5-year targets and sub-targets. For the first time, there had to be an explicit tie-in in which she said in advance, here's what the next 3-year energy efficiency program is going to deliver for us as we trend toward 2050 and realizing these every 5-year limits and sublimits. We then went further. We did build in the social cost of carbon. So we explicitly said in designing the next 3-year plan, and it happened to be for 2022 through 2024, incorporate the social value of greenhouse gas emissions reductions. It's very close to the social value of carbon, but it states it in an emissions reduction form. Give us the social value of greenhouse gas emissions reduction and build it into all the pricing for your energy efficiency program. And then the final thing we did, just to tie this sense of accountability and data tracking closely, is that we said to the DPU at the conclusion of every time period, and again, energy efficiency for us is a 3-year effort, at the conclusion of every time period, tell us whether the Secretary's original objective was attained, and if not, tell us in what way the utilities and the program fell short and what we can then hope to do about it. So we're trying to really tie things very explicitly, because it's been our perception that as good as energy efficiency programs are, the stewards of those programs have all kinds of ownership investments in making sure that they don't become a part of the larger emissions reduction fight. So the legislature in this case stepped in to make that happen.
Thank you so much, State Senator Barrett. We really appreciate it. And now we're going to turn over to Rebecca Foster, who's the CEO of VEIC. That was a lot of acronyms just now. And she's going to share with us a bit about the work that VEIC has been doing on climate forward efficiency. They really get into the implementation of climate forward efficiency. So look forward to hearing from that, Rebecca.
Great. Thank you, Rachel. And hello, everyone. It's great to be with all of you today. As Rachel said, VEIC is right in the thick of this transition. Our mission is to generate the energy solutions that the world needs, and we achieve that mission by working with clients across the country to deploy innovative and equitable decarbonization solutions. And my take is that this is the most important work that we need to be doing as an industry, swiftly pivoting the nation's energy efficiency programs to focus on greenhouse gas reductions in addition to electricity savings is a critical step to combating climate change. And VEIC is working to model that critical transition now in a few different ways. So first, I'll share some examples of our work in large-scale efficiency programs we operate, and then give an example from our national consulting practice. So let's start with Vermont. There is a lot going on in the small state of Vermont where VEIC administers the Efficiency Vermont program. One key shift is that for the first time, we are now measuring the success of our portfolio in part through a greenhouse gas reduction metric. And this has allowed us to really focus on new areas such as refrigerant management programs. We know that reducing refrigerant leaks improves electrical efficiency, but it also keeps highly potent greenhouse gases from leaking into the atmosphere. And our greenhouse gas metric allows us to measure both the energy-related greenhouse gas reductions and the non-energy related reductions from things like refrigerant leakage. Another key shift in Vermont is our move into electric vehicles. This was a change that required legislative action, and VEIC worked with a coalition of utility partners and environmental advocates to lay out the rationale and the benefits of the change. So Act 151 enables us to work in the area of greenhouse gas reductions in the transportation and heating sectors using electric efficiency funding, provided there is a nexus with electricity. So we are now working on electric vehicles, running a statewide dealer training program, and offering salesperson incentives. And this work really bolsters the direct-to-customer electric vehicle incentives that are offered by the state of Vermont and by the Vermont electric utilities. So by working in partnership with these entities, we're making it easier for customers to access EVs, and we're speeding up EV adoption at all levels of the supply chain. Rachel also mentioned our goals in the District of Columbia, where VEIC administers the DC Sustainable Energy Utility. We do have a greenhouse gas goal there now alongside our many other goals, including deep retrofit goals and green jobs goals and megawatt hour reduction goals. I'd be happy to go into those more during the discussion. It is truly both an art and a science to measure and meet all of those criteria every year. And before I close, just one more thing I'd like to offer as an example from VEIC's consulting work across the country in California. We're also a partner on the Tech Clean California program. And this is a $120 million statewide initiative that's seeking to decarbonize space and water heating in California, while also ensuring that 40% of the program benefits go to low-income and disadvantaged communities. The program includes everything from distributor engagement to contractor training to innovative pilots to prove out heat pump technology in very difficult to serve applications like large multifamily retrofits. The work that we're doing on Clean Tech California is in partnership with Energy Solutions and a slew of other organizations really committed to creating lasting greenhouse gas reductions in space and water heating. And we're focused together on creating scalable models that can be shared with other states, and very excited to see where that leads. So in closing, I would just want to offer that we often hear this is the decade of action on climate, and VEIC believes that wholeheartedly. And every day we are pushing the limits of innovation to try and make an impact. It's been great to share a bit of that with you today, and I look forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Rebecca. All right, so moving from the cold east to the very currently cold Denver metro area, I'll turn it over to Justin Brandt, who's the Utility Program Co-Director at SWEEP. And Justin, excited to hear about what's happening. I'm based here in Denver, and what's happening in Colorado these days?
Thanks, Rachel, and welcome to Colorado. You're recently moved out here. So in 2019, the legislature in Colorado established statewide greenhouse gas emission reduction targets to reduce emissions from 2005 levels by 26% by 2025, 50% by 2030, and 90% by 2050. The state government then worked to develop a roadmap of the suite of policies necessary to achieve those reductions with a focus on the near term, sort of 2030 targets. And the roadmap called for essentially complete decarbonization of residential and commercial buildings by 2050. And it laid out a number of strategy options, policy options to get there. So in 2021, last year in the legislative session, the legislature took up a number of those bills, and I'm going to highlight 3 in particular that will expand energy efficiency from natural gas utilities, as well as building electrification in the state. So first, House Bill 21-1238 updated the state's policy on natural gas demand-side management programs. It directs the Public Utility Commission to establish goals for natural gas utilities based on sort of all cost-effective and achievable energy efficiency. It removes a prohibition on fuel switching for natural gas utilities, and it also updates cost effectiveness testing methodology. So it adds a social cost of carbon and social cost of methane to the cost effectiveness test out here, and mandates the use of a customer focused discount rate instead of the utility weighted average cost of capital. The bill also sets minimum spending requirements for income qualified programs of 25% of residential funding, and essentially requires the approval of decoupling proposals from natural gas utilities in the state. Second, the legislature also adopted a clean heat standard for our natural gas utilities. So it established emission reduction standards for the investor-owned utilities. So they're required to reduce emissions from 2015 levels by 4% in 2025 and 22% in 2030. So to comply with the standard, the utilities are required to develop clean heat plans that lay out sort of the suite of resources that they're going to use to meet the emission reduction standards in the legislation. So this can include energy efficiency, beneficial electrification, leak reduction on their distribution system, biomethane, and a few other specific technologies that are called out in the legislation. The legislation also sets a cost cap on complying with it, so that when plans are before the utility, if it's more than 2.5% of bills in the short term, the commission will have to consider sort of the other costs and benefits of the programs. And in addition, there's limits to so in terms of recovered methane, biomethane, leak reduction, there's limits to the amount that those resources that are not directly reducing natural gas emissions can play in meeting the emissions standard. And then finally, the legislature also passed a bill requiring electric utilities in the state to develop programs and plans related to beneficial electrification. So again, this prioritizes income qualified programs in the state and requires the inclusion of the social cost of carbon and the social cost of methane in measuring the effectiveness of the programs. So I'd say similar to Minnesota, we're in the implementation phase for all of these policies. The Public Utility Commission is currently writing the rules around the clean heat plans and gas demand response or demand side management bills I spoke of. And similarly, we expect the first clean heat plans must be filed by electric utilities this summer. So we're all working hard on implementing it and happy to answer any questions in the Q&A. Thanks, Rachel.
Thanks, Justin. And I think you've teed us our next speaker up well. We're now going to turn it over to Nick Mark, who's the Director of DSM Strategy and Policy over at Xcel Energy. So we've heard a little bit about both Minnesota and Colorado, 2 of the states that Xcel serves. So Nick, looking forward to hearing your perspective on these issues.
Yeah, thanks. So I think Xcel is, at least that I could come up with, the only entity that gets to operate under both the eco legislation as well as the bills that we just heard about from Justin. And my team in particular gets the privilege, I'd say, of getting to play in both of those spaces. That our legislative bodies in 2021 were super busy, and we are working our way through the outcome. I think there are a lot of tremendous opportunities. I'm not going to cover the same ground that Jamie and Anthony and Justin already did as far as the details. I think when we think about these changes and the new frameworks that they set up, we think about what they mean in terms of what programs we can offer our customers, where there may be challenges in hitting some of the goals, but also what opportunities they create, again, both for our customers as well as for us as a company. We've actually already been incentivizing natural gas to electric conversions in our Colorado territory through our gas DSM programs. And we're excited to bring that to Minnesota as those rules get finalized and figured out. I think that one of the things that we see is, although, at least in Colorado, there is a pretty close tie to some binding emissions targets. And we think that energy efficiency on both the electric and gas side is going to be critical, obviously, to hitting both our state goals as well as our corporate goals. There is still, I think, a little bit of work yet to figure out around getting all of our policy mechanisms aligned. And what I mean by that is, although we consider some of the cost of GHG pollutants when we're thinking about cost effectiveness in Colorado, and indeed in Minnesota as well, those aren't necessarily reflected in the prices of energy that customers see. And that creates a challenge in terms of driving participation. So we're working through how we motivate customers around something that, at least on paper, is cost effective from a climate perspective, but their own pocketbook may be affected a little differently. And how do we drive that? Now, it's not a new problem in the sense that trying to get customers to save gas over the last decade or so of historically pretty low prices has been a challenge, but we've been able to be successful at it. But it is going to be tricky. The other thing is that in both states, that efficiency programs, unlike what we heard about in Massachusetts, don't have defined emission reduction goals associated with them, right? Their goals are measured in energy savings. And I think that's a reasonable thing for an energy efficiency program, because although climate is super important, it is not the only thing you're trying to do with energy efficiency. But increasingly, we're seeing a need to think about exactly how those savings targets align with emissions targets. And it'll get particularly challenging for us as a utility that has a goal of being 80% carbon free by the end of this decade. And indeed, we're already, we've cut emissions since 2005 by over 50%. And so as we take that carbon out of the electricity, and as it's increasingly generated from resources that don't consume fuel, how does that change your cost effectiveness model? How does that change the way you're thinking about load building or the time of day or the location where you're either encouraging or avoiding use? And how do you make the systems kind of work better together, both the electric and the gas system? And that's kind of the last thing I'd touch on, is that we are both a gas and electric utility that serves large cold markets. And we don't see the need for a gas LDC going away in the markets that we serve, just based on the need for peak heating and the expense of retrofits in these markets. New construction, it might be a slightly different story, But most of the homes that we're going to be dealing with over the next couple decades have already been built. And so figuring out how we get more efficiency and less carbon out of those properties is really important. And we think that the gas system is going to play a really important role in providing reliable heat on peak in a way that avoids a need to overbuild the generation capacity on the electric side, but also represents a, you can do that while still having a very significant reduction in overall throughput and overall emissions from the gas side. That in turn kind of brings us back to policy and the point that was, I think, very appropriately highlighted early on this afternoon around centering equity and making sure that as we do sort of work to change customer usage patterns and affect customer decisions around how they interact with their utility, how they fuel their lives, making sure that we're properly addressing the costs that are being incurred to serve those needs, and making sure that whether it's stranded asset risk or simply a high bill on the new system, making sure that we're thinking about that proactively and by engaging with the people who are likely to be affected. There's probably a whole lot more I could say, but I'll stop there.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, I think it's very clear that Excel is thinking about all of the different elements of the climate forward efficiency roadmap. And so appreciate your comments and your thoughts on that. Look forward to hearing more about it as we move forward. Next, I'm going to turn it just around the Great Lakes to Illinois. I'm going to introduce Delmar Gillis, the Chief Operating Officer of Elevate. There's been a lot going on in Illinois with the recent passage of the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act. Delmar, look forward to hearing a little bit more about that.
Thanks very much, Rachel, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a great honor and very exciting to be on to participate in this conversation. As Rachel mentioned, my name is Delmar Gillis. I work at an organization called Elevate. Elevate focuses on ensuring everyone has access to clean air, clean water, and clean energy. And in that capacity, we were part of what's called the Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition, which was a coalition of community-based organizations and environmental organizations that worked on Illinois' Climate and Equitable Jobs Act. As part of that bill, I was asked to be one of the chief negotiators representing the coalition with a focus on equity. So as I talk about CEJA, the conversation around focusing on equity was very important, and I was very excited, Rachel and Mike, the way that you drafted your paper, because centering and focusing on equity was important. But when we look at CEJA, the core components of CEJA were around jobs and economic justice, inclusive financing, carbon-free power, renewable energy, energy efficiency, electric transportation, just transition, especially for workers and communities that were impacted by fossil fuel transitions to clean energy, and utility accountability, grid planning, and also low-income relief. And what I was really excited about is a lot of times you see these bills and they are very focused on dealing with decarbonization, and then there's a separate section on equity that often focuses on training. What we did in this bill was focus the entire bill, centered it around equity, and made sure there was equity in every component. In addition to that, the bill provides $82 million a year well into the 2040s that focuses on workforce development as well as contractor equity programs. And from a centering equity perspective, just to give some context, 40% of the benefits, especially around solar, EV, and the grid, must go to equity eligible communities. So there's a very solid foundation. So what I'll spend the last 20 seconds or so just talking about are just some of the high level provisions. For instance, we created training hubs that focus on workforce development, but rather than workforce development just being training, it's really focused on creating jobs, retaining jobs, and most importantly, the support services. So everything from tools to equipment to things that people need in order to do their jobs. We also have built into the bill, and once again, I was happy to see this in your paper, a strong section on accountability measures. One of the things that I was very passionate about is if everybody in the state is paying into these programs, a company should not be able to access incentives without ensuring that they meet certain diversity and equity requirements. And as I mentioned, there were also very strong supports around support services. And one of the things that we were most proud of was that we were able to build a structure around building capital, because oftentimes small diverse businesses can't wait for a project to be completed and energized before they get their incentive dollars. So we actually have incentive grant dollars built in so that companies can do pre-engineering work. They can do things like purchase equipment, supplies, solar panels, et cetera, for their projects, in addition to getting incentives. The bill is over 1,000 pages long, and to talk about it in 3 minutes, even the equity section is a tall order. But Rachel and Mike, it was a pleasure to get an opportunity to kind of preview it. I'll also put some information in the chat for those that want to dig into some of the equity provisions more, and I'm definitely happy to talk about it during the follow-up. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you, Delmar. It was indeed a tall order, and I think you were equal to it. Thank you. I'm going to turn it over now to Carmen Best, who is the Vice President of Policy and Emerging Markets at Recurve. Recurve's been doing a lot of really interesting work around data access and data usage and emerging markets for energy efficiency. So I'm excited to hear sort of the implementation perspective from Carmen around this work.
Thanks, Rachel. I was trying to boil down my talking points to kind of 2 things that we're focusing on, because to be totally honest, we've had a lot more than that have been really driving our work over the last 1.5 years. And there's so much to share. So please reach out to me later if you want to dig in on more details. But the 2 examples that I wanted to highlight are really a core illustration of the power of data-driven program designs, and my fave, embedded measurement verification. So coupling program design with robust measurement verification to drive towards these climate forward solutions. So at the core of data solutions has to be the secure flow of data to build confidence in demand side investments and ensure that they can in turn be used within market models, because markets rely on trust and the exchange of information, and the flow of data and being able to have this common view of performance is kind of the essence of what energy markets are going to need. And in particular, energy efficiency growing into those markets are going to have to step up the bar to be able to demonstrate their value in that context. So the 2 examples that I wanted to highlight were a project that we did with the California ISO this last year, and then another project called the Market Access Model that was adopted also in California. Home state, so I'm taking liberties there. But the California ISO project was done in partnership with the ISO to utilize a new baseline methodology for understanding the impacts of demand response. It came out of these extreme heat events that we had in California in 2020, and we coupled that analysis with our comparison group analysis. And this was one of the first times that this methodology, while it's approved for the California ISO, had actually been able to be used or tested in the context of settlement for supply side demand response resources. One of the things that enabled it was that we were able to utilize differential privacy to offer privacy protections to non-participant data sets, and still be able to do the analysis without sacrificing the privacy of non-participants, but still have a better understanding how participants were really driving change to the grid. This is a stepping stone for being able to use non-participant comparison groups and comparison groups generally in any aspect of demand side analysis. And I would love to be able to get to that as a default comparison approach for all kinds of assessing all kinds of energy efficiency investments. The other one I wanted to highlight with my last minute is the market access model. This was adopted at the end of December or beginning of December, but end of the last year, wherein the California Public Utilities Commission was answering the call from the governor of emergency resources needing to come forward. They adopted an open source procurement model called, they called it the market access model. We call it at Recurve the demand flex market. And what it does is it's a next generation meter-based performance model wherein technology agnostic solutions can come forward from a wide range of aggregators and be able to be judged and assessed on a common measurement verification framework, but then also be driving back to understanding how it's going to affect the grid for demand response reductions as well as long-term load shaping. So it's a great example of being able to blend energy efficiency and demand response, and it's also utilizing California's new total system benefits metrics, which love to talk more about that too. So very excited about these innovations, and I will stop there because I'm over time. Sorry, Rachel.
No, thank you. Thank you so much, Carmen. And for more on total system benefits, check out the first of the ClimateForward Efficiency papers, where there's a lot of detail about that. On the topic of privacy and data, I'm excited to turn it over for our last speaker to Scott Hinson, who is the Chief Technology Officer at Pecan Street. Scott, take it away.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk about three things real fast. For those of you that don't know, Pecan Street is a 501c3 nonprofit based in Austin, Texas, but we have test beds all over the country. And what we do is we install monitoring equipment for all sorts of things behind the utility meter in folks' homes. And so we understand in ways, this gets back to one of the original sort of 9 principles at the beginning, right, for data availability. We understand how people are using their energy, where changes of energy use would impact them the most, especially with things like time of use rates and things like that. So we collect about, for some of our volunteer participants, we collect about 10.5 million data points a day from those homes. We collect in upwards of 4 billion data points daily from our test beds across the country. And we're on a roadmap to 7 billion by the end of the year, because we're adding Detroit and Puerto Rico. Historically, we have looked, frankly, at sort of higher income participant sets, and we are trying to fix that inequality, and we're trying to get into areas where we understand the impact of electrification on lower middle income groups. So we've got some of our first houses coming online right now. One of the homes that we just turned on for data collection is in Puerto Rico. And we've seen some very interesting things already, to the point of things like voltage regulation on the island being so bad that we're worrying about basically things breaking inside the home. So now all of a sudden it's not just about energy efficiency, it's about quality of life and being able to run the water heater when you want to, because the grid's gone out and they're running on batteries and all sorts of things like that. Lastly, on the energy efficiency side, we've got a number of reports at our website. I'll put the link in the chat. I see it's been a vigorous chat so far around energy efficiency and the potential savings. But I'd also like to make a plug for informed decisions on operation of devices. It's one thing to say you're going to electrify, that comes at a fairly high cost, but there's lower cost ways to do it and easier ways to do it if the data is available and the control systems and standards are in place around controlling devices like heating and vehicle charging and things like that.
Thank you, Scott.
I think I was under 3 minutes.
Fantastic. So, so we unfortunately only have about 12 minutes for us to do Q&A, and we've had, as Scott mentioned, a really vigorous Q&A session. So I have a couple of questions that I've collected as you guys have been chatting, but if there are additional ones, please feel free to add them into the chat, and I know some of our speakers can also address them in real time as well. I will start with a question that anyone on the panel can feel free to take. Just raise your hand if you'd like to jump in using the raise your hand feature. Are any of you in states or aware of states that are currently using the social cost of carbon as a metric in energy efficiency programs? This person specifically asked about residential energy efficiency programs. Anyone aware of places where that's happening and how that's going?
Yeah, Massachusetts, Rachel, is using the social cost of carbon. We obviously don't use it at the individual residential consumer level, so you'd have to refine your question. But yes, we are incorporating it into every calculation the DPU makes, every evaluation of our energy efficiency program, and every calculation the electric and gas utilities make as well.
Yeah, I would say the same thing in Colorado. So we're now using the social cost of carbon and social cost of methane for cost effectiveness for gas and electric DSM, as well as beneficial electrification programs.
Yeah, same in Minnesota as well, Rachel.
Awesome. Thank you, Anthony, Justin, and Mike. I'll turn to the next question that actually just popped in from Tom, which is regarding climate change. How are states and utilities preparing for much higher cooling loads, both peak and average, along with increased electrification over the next decade and beyond? I'll also pair that with a question that we heard earlier around what's happening in terms of legislative and regulatory efforts to reduce emissions generated by the electric grid. So obviously we're walking and chewing gum with managing climate forward efficiency and cleaning up the electric grid. Curious to hear any reflections on either of those areas from folks, especially those who haven't spoken yet. Rebecca.
Thanks, those are great questions. And I'll take the first one about how states are preparing. Vermont in particular, where VEIC is headquartered, though we work around the country, Vermont has a long-term planning process that both the transmission utility in the state, Velco, participates in, as well as all of the utilities across the state. And there's a very robust connection between the work that Efficiency Vermont does on the demand side and those supply side planning processes, so that we are all coordinating, collaborating. And one of the things that, as a kind of cold climate state, we're seeing is that as the climate changes, we're seeing more and more, potentially inefficient cooling systems moving in, whether that's room air conditioners or, central air conditioners, and really doing a tremendous amount of work to try and transition folks over to heat pump technology as the best approach to meet future needs for safe and efficient cooling at the same time that we're trying to meet needs from an electric system perspective to have reliable and affordable and clean energy sources out for Vermonters. So that's just one example of how connecting the dots across those sometimes separate silos of electric system planning are helping us prepare, and at the same time really raising consumer awareness about the need for cooling and what the best ways are to meet those new needs. So there's a lot of different facets to the work, but working on all fronts, we've been able to create some good successes here in terms of heat pump adoption.
Fantastic. I'm hearing a lot of energy around energy efficiency truly as a resource and really thinking about connecting the dots between the supply and demand sides.
Exactly.
Any other reactions to those questions around some of the changes that we're seeing on the electric sector? Delmar.
Yes, and I just wanted to kind of add in that as we're thinking about these changes, it's really important from the context of centering equity to make sure that we are planning and supporting underserved communities as they transition. A lot of the programs now are really starting to take a hard look at how are we engaging underserved communities? What are we doing to ensure contractors of color have a role in the installation and maintenance of some of these new technologies? So as we're talking about kind of this transition, I just wanted to highlight the importance of making sure that there's an equity focus on these transitions as these new programs come online.
Thank you so much, Delmar. It's a really important point to make sure we have in mind, and that it was exciting to see the Illinois legislation really center. Carmen.
Yeah, I wanted to piggyback on both what Delmar was saying and also what Rebecca was saying and give an example. Rebecca had noted that VEIC is part of the Green Tech Alliance in California, which is the residential deployment of heat pumps and heat pump water heaters. And a big component of that is equity. Another big component, Recurve is one of the slew of subcontractors working on that project. And one of the ways we're operationalizing that is to do pre-analysis of where cooling loads might be changing and where the biggest opportunities are for improved efficiency with heat pumps, or at least not harmful bill impacts, or if there might be significant bill impacts, being able to couple those with strategies to mitigate it, so you don't accidentally or inadvertently exacerbate issues as you're trying to rectify access and clean energy solutions across the board. So that's one example. And then also for what Delmar was saying, I think operationalizing those equity questions, prioritization, and adding in kind of value adders into your value stack is another strategy that we're using in this market access program. And we'll see kind of how those examples end up working out. But it's the intentionality behind it and also some structural operationalizing it that I think will be interesting to see how that works out.
Thank you, Carmen. And then my last question, and I'll just note that I'd particularly love to hear from Jamie, Nick, and Scott, who haven't had a chance, but anyone's welcome to join in. You know, the findings in the paper are in some ways exciting, right? There are some shining stars of utilities, cities, and states who are taking action. But at the end of the day, it's relatively few who have done so thus far. It's pretty sobering. So Scott Bernstein asks, what are some of the efforts that we're seeing to enhance state and local performance and accountability? And are there efforts to create better policies and lower perceived barriers to more states and places becoming effective performers? How can we raise the bar across the country? Anyone have insights on that question?
So I'll just pipe in here. Minnesota has a split legislature. Our Senate, it was Republican, our House is Democratic. So I would simply say is work in coalitions. If you're looking to pass legislation forward, kind of understand maybe some of the barriers that you're working with, but broad coalitions really do help to advance, just from our perspective.
Thanks, Jamie. An important sort of strategy for getting this across the finish line. It looked like Delmar is raising his hand. Delmar.
Yeah, and I don't know if this gets at all of the aspects of Scott's question, but I would say part of what we tried to do with the CEJA legislation, and this was based on past experience where organizations were taking advantage of the incentives but weren't doing things to center equity and track metrics, is we basically built into, and we'll be building into, like the program applications where if you're applying for dollars from the state, you have to meet certain criteria in order to access the dollars. So for instance, are you hiring people from the workforce program? You know, are you meeting certain minimum diversity requirements? It also requires you with your subcontractors to capture some demographic data on the subs and the organizations you're working with. So there's kind of a shared both data collection aspect as well as some requirements. And then the comments that the previous speaker made are very important around coalition building and making sure that the coalitions have some shared guiding principles about how these programs are going to work and function, especially as it relates to metrics, data collection, reporting, and accountability, because you can't fix and you can't work on things that you're not measuring. So one of the key steps is to actually begin to collect data and information about key metrics that are important to the states, and the coalitions are a good way to push those forward.
Thank you so much, Delmar. And then last but not least, Rebecca, I think you were maybe about to jump in on this question. This will be our last answer before we turn it back to Edward.
Perfect, thanks. Well, this brings together a thread from the previous two responders. So one of the things I wanted to share was just how Efficiency Vermont moved some of this work forward in Vermont. And I couldn't agree more on coalitions and data. And one of the pieces of data that we surfaced that was so valuable in the legislature was that in terms of energy burden, Vermonters' energy burden starts with transportation and moves to heating, and then electricity is number 3. It just so happens the GHG emissions are in exactly the same order. So reorienting the efficiency program to focus on where the greatest greenhouse gases are and the greatest costs for Vermont families was a no-brainer. And that helped us get the very conservative governor on board with the approach. So just couldn't agree more on the importance of coalitions and on bringing good data to the table that can really speak to the needs of the policymakers.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all so much. I wish we had another couple of hours, but I do believe Edward's going to be sharing a little bit about some future opportunities to connect on this topic. And that was my alarm that was supposed to go off so that I knew to transfer to Edward. So I'll do that now. Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Rachel, and thank you to all the guest speakers. That was really terrific. And thank you again all for attending the symposium. But before we close, I'd like to go over some key information about next steps. So just stay with me for a few more minutes. So at ACEEE, we have a bunch of ideas about what we think will expedite this effort. But more importantly, we want to hear about your ideas and what you think will expedite and scale up this effort. So our next event will consist of more focused discussions to hear about your ideas in smaller groups, but on key topics. So our day 2 event will be held on March 24th, Thursday, from 2:30 to 4. So exactly same time, 1 month from now. And it will consist of 3 facilitated breakout sessions that will run concurrently. And the results of the discussions from those sessions will be shared with everyone. So and the topics of these sessions were curated based on a survey of your interest when you first registered for today's event. And the topics are 1, advancing efficiency measures for beneficial electrification. I don't think this incredibly popular topic needs an introduction, but suffice to say that this covers a key pillar of decarbonization. We're seeing a scaling up of this effort. Second topic is measuring greenhouse gas reductions. So moving forward on workable approaches and needed data. So this is a data use and data access discussion involving grid emissions, conversion factors, additionality, emissionality, if you know what that is, and quantifying the locational and durational impacts of demand-side resources. The third topic is an important one, facilitating legislative and regulatory change that we just discussed. Which states might present good opportunities for climate-forward efficiency this year and next year. So this topic would give us a collaborative opportunity to survey the commission and state landscapes and identify high impact opportunities where there may be a demand for climate-forward efficiency among legislators and regulators. So in my view, nothing is more powerful for progress than a great example, and we'll be looking for opportunities where we can set a great example. So there are other topics that we'll address in a separate forum, such as the value of energy efficiency and how to reflect them accurately in the context of energy plans like IRPs and DRPs, but also in the context of equity-driven plans like resilience plans, land use plans, and environmental plans. So we'll create an opportunity to discuss these other topics that won't be featured on day 2. So all of you will receive an email next Wednesday with a registration link for this day 2 event. And in your registration process, you'll be able to identify which session you would like to attend. So finally, I have a few reminders before we say goodbye. But first, I'd like to recognize and thank Shannon Pressler, our awesome intern, for her work with us in the past few months and her invaluable help in putting this event together. The reminders are that you'll again receive a link to a recording of today's event along with the slides and the transcript. You can also download the roadmap report on our ClimateForward Efficiency page of our website, and you should be able to, a link to that report should appear on the chat. And you can sign up to receive updates by subscribing to this initiative, which you can do on our ClimateForward Efficiency page. You'll receive a bi-monthly newsletter as well as opportunities to attend and participate in future webinars and working groups. And if you're interested in sponsoring any of this work, there are opportunities with our development team and you can email Charlie Heron for more, and his email should also be popping up on the chat box. So I think that's it. Any questions on what on the information that I just shared in the minute that we have? Okay, hearing none, my sincere thanks to all of you, to moderator, to Rachel Gold, and to our presenter, Mike Specia, and all the distinguished speakers who shared their views and made this a really exciting forum in my view. So thank you again, and have a good rest of the day.